Okay, hello everybody. Um, Welcome. Um, as I was sharing with our speaker, tomorrow will mark 2 years since we first reached out to Professor Livermon, um, then an associate professor of Africa and African diaspora studies at the University of Texas at Austin, to invite him to speak for our cluster. Um, as we began to plan for an April 2020 event, the world changed. Um, for some more than others, but for all of us, certainly to some degree. Um, Several postponements, COVID waves, variations, a vaccine, a US presidential and IHR administration change, and for Professor Livermon, um, a monograph publication, uh, a move, half country move, halfway across the country, and a new job later. Here we are. Um, Professor Xavier Livermon, now an associate professor of feminist studies, critical and race studies, I'm sorry, critical race studies and ethnic studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz, has borne with us through it all and far more emails than he ever bargained for. I am thrilled, however, to be able to introduce him today. The author of Cueto Bodies, Remastering Space and Subjectivity in Post-Apartheid South Africa, Duke University Press, April 2020, um, and numerous articles and book chapters. Professor Livermon has consistently attended to the ways in which minoritized communities challenge racialized, often very specifically white, heteropatriarchy. Imagining freedom, reconfiguring spaces, generating, quote, moments of possibility through performance, popular culture, play, African and African American communities. He has shown push for, generate their, our liberation within structures that seek to limit and confine them. His work is important and his writing is fluid and beautiful. So if you haven't read his work, I encourage you all to do so. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Livermon. Thank you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me fine? Okay, thank you. So first of all, I want to just start by thanking the Institute for Humanities Research, the Colonial, Post-Colonial, and Decolonial Research Cluster, Melissa and Isaac specifically, and everybody else who's kind of signed in here today, who is going to listen to me chat a little bit about this new work that I'm doing. I definitely don't take, particularly in this time period, engagement with my work lightly. And so I definitely very much appreciate your attendance today. And I look forward to our conversation. Just to, before I jump into a couple of caveats or frameworks, I just want to pull something out of Melissa's introduction, where she talks about how my work speaks to these moments of possibility. And I think that this talk is very much in that vein. So, I'm very much kind of interested in this particular talk with trying to think through what a moment of possibility meant back in late 2020, or late, we'll call it late 2020, and what that possibility might portend for thinking through a certain set of social, economic, and political relations in South Africa. And of course, with the notion that what's happening in South Africa can have ruminations I guess repercussions and so forth for how we might think about this throughout the global South, and how we might think about this in relationship to global South communities as they exist in the global North. So let me share my screen so that I just realized I hadn't done that. Um, sorry. Okay. So hopefully the slides will pop up in just a second. But in the meantime, I just want to start off by stating that, this is work in the preliminary stages. So I really do welcome feedback and commentary about it. Secondly, that I do spend a bit of time framing out the context through which Black queer communities are sort of navigating, but I do want to make clear that the context, and in this case, what I mean by context is, frankly, for lack of a better way to talk about it, the sort of multiple violences, right, that Black queer people are subjected to in the South African context. I want to make sure that it's it's offered up as context, but it's not meant to be the focus of this particular talk, right? Rather, what I'm most interested in is not so much the anti-queer violence, but rather how Black queer people create various different kinds of solutions, manage their lives in particular kinds of ways, and try to create something new. So there may be there's a bit of focus on the context, as I want people to understand what people are navigating, but I also want to be clear that the context of anti-queer violence is not the focus of this particular talk. So let me go ahead and jump in. In September of 2020, at the height of a number of vulnerabilities and displacements faced by African queer youth in Cape Town, we see you, an artivist, and they describe themselves as activist artists, collective of queer people of color, rented a high-end Airbnb in Cape Town's upscale Camps Bay. Their intention to overstay their original booking and illegally occupy the holiday accommodation to highlight the lack of safe spaces, particularly stable accommodation for queer, particularly trans and gender nonconforming queer youth of color. Their refusal to leave was a protest, an act of defiance, and we could also argue a demonstration of critical resistance by African queer youth. For the purposes of this preliminary examination, I would like to highlight the concepts of safe houses for African queer youth as a strategy of mutual aid and alternative Black geographies, to think through how a lens of Black performance and Black digital media might be useful analytical tools for thinking through their protests, and to rethink the land question. And maybe perhaps we might even say a larger question around decoloniality from the lens of queerness, and to think through new political identity formations in post-apartheid South Africa. So just with that, there's a lot going on. So I definitely welcome, advice on maybe what of that is most interesting to folks. Statistics regarding young queer folks on the African continent are notoriously difficult to assess. Many studies on youth do not engage the intersection of gender and sexuality, while simultaneously many studies of gender and sexuality often fail to adequately represent the perspectives of African queer youth. However, the few studies that do exist reveal an increased vulnerability of African queer youth to multiple forms of societal and state oppression and violence. This is even in the case of a country like South Africa, lauded for its constitutional protections and progressive legislation. Exclusions often begin in the education system, making it less likely for queer youth to complete their educations or perform well in school. This often affects their ability to navigate skewed job markets in which opportunities are few for young people. Surveys regarding healthcare reveal unequal outcomes and high forms of discrimination when attempting to access health services, particularly at the state level. These state forms of exclusions, are also buttressed by relatively conservative family attitudes that make African queer youth vulnerable to houselessness. Compounded with the lack of educational opportunities and limited job prospects, the precarity of African queer youth, particularly African queer youth of color, often means that these communities must create alternative societal structures and familial structures in order to support and build new notions of home. Sorry, just To respond to these challenges, African queer folk have often created a number of informal safe houses for themselves. Houselessness, of course, also compounds other elements of vulnerability, and lacking the ability to obtain assistance through formal governments and NGOs, African queer communities have often had to create their own safe houses. I would like to think of these safe houses as being part of a long tradition of building alternative societal formations, in this case, alternative families that often mark queer existence. However, I also think it's useful to imagine these practices as rooted in long genealogies of mutual aid in African and Black communities and among the queer population in particular, right? So mutual aid and sort of alternative formations, of course, are not just simply limited to queer folk, right? The point that I want to make is that queer folk access these sort of other traditions that are already existing, and of course, mobilize them for their own purposes. These safe houses generally are informal spaces where a member of the African queer community offers shelter temporarily or permanently to African queer youth who generally have no other spaces to go after being disowned by family. This twin abandonment by both the state and society often necessitates the creation of these alternative spaces. In these places of privacy, African queer youth can seek respite from the unrelenting homophobia and transphobia of the society, and steel themselves for navigating the multiple forms of vulnerability they face. These homes are also a way for these same youth to recreate and reimagine the family structures that have often been so exclusionary and harmful to them. In this sense, safe houses could be read as an example of how African queer youth practice forms of thinking otherwise. It is also important for me to think through how these safe houses provide an alternative geography of the family, one that takes the city from an exclusionary and violent space, or we should say an urban area maybe, into one that allows for queer possibility and livable lives. So I offer as an example these queer safe houses that have developed in Nigeria and South Africa respectively, and profile them to offer a sense of what these houses provide their occupants. It is, of course, let me be clear, I offer this because I want to show the kinds of things that folks are doing on the ground on their own, right? And not so much to offer up a comparative analysis between Nigeria and South Africa, but just to give examples of how these things are sort of happening on the ground in different social locations. And I think the Nigerian example is being offered as well, to think through how these things happen in spaces with a far less friendly, let's say, legal climate than in South Africa. So in September of 2020, so this is all happening around the same time, Days magazine published a series of photographs of the Lagos queer safe house, which was named the House of Allure, taken by noted South African photographer Sabelo Mlangeni. Mlangeni detailed how he came to know about the safe house, how he gained trust with the community, and how that trust led to a collaborative art project. What I would like to highlight here is the nature of risk and security that was omnipresent by the members of the house. Mlangeni explains, this House of Allure is offering the LGBTQ community a sober space, a space where we can be ourselves without worrying about the outside world, which is just at the doorstep, where we have to take on a different face whenever we walk out on the streets because of danger. Speaking to one of the members of the House about the potential danger of public scrutiny due to this photographic project and its appearance in a fairly well-known global magazine, one of the members, James Brown, asked Mlangeni, if my country kicked me out because I collaborated with you, would your country, in this case, South Africa, give me a safe place to hide? Here, I would like to think through both the lack of safety and security, but also this notion of South Africa as a quote unquote safe space, or almost like harboring space for queers from the African continent. And of course, the fact that it often fails to be that safe space, right? Either for folks fleeing homophobic violence from elsewhere on the continent or its own, queer folk. But part of what I want to think about is this lack of safety and security, and to highlight that this is what queer folks have to navigate, but as well the sense of lack of hopefulness that comes from attempting to create these additional spaces of safety that sort of operate somewhat informally. So in South Africa, there have been similar attempts on the ground, both informal and formal, that have been created. One of which was a house called Timbalani, which was located in Manenberg, one of Cape Town's townships, and was an example of such a hybrid informal NGO space that was started by a community member before ultimately being affiliated with the religious. And I couldn't find information about whether it was a queer affirming religious organization, but I'm going to say hopefully or ostensibly queer affirming um, organization. But what I'm interested here in highlighting in this discussion is that it reveals the forms of precarity that less resource queer South Africans, who are overwhelmingly Black, must navigate. And so when you are from a wealthier and more privileged background, the kinds of familial alienation are not generally, right, as I'm not saying it's not a psychic or psychological toll, right, but it doesn't tend to be as big of a material toll, right? But for those who are queer, who are queer and on poorer, this this ends up being a significant loss if your family kicks you out of the home, right? Or if your family is not supportive of you in a particular kind of way. And I'm thinking here of the interviews that were done with members who were living in Timbalami, who described the relief of being able to get a peaceful night of sleep or to feel safe from bullying and intimidation. You know, someone in one of the interviews stated it was amazing to uh, think critically about how much they had missed just having a peaceful night's sleep, right? You know, and how that this house was able to sort of provide that for them. So now I want to shift a little bit to talk about the collective and more my specific case study in the South African case. Um, so in the midst of an ongoing set of crises, a collective of African queer artists, mostly women and all people of color, gathered together to think about the continuous problem of houselessness for African queer youth in Cape Town. It is important to note that the violence, both state and non-state, experienced by African queer youth is exacerbated by gender and gender nonconformity. Hence, within the queer community, those who are women, gender nonconforming, and trans bear a disproportionate amount of experiences of exclusion. The group went about their choice to occupy the home systemically. It took 3 or 4 months of research, organizing, and culture building before the group booked the house through Airbnb with the intention of remaining and occupying it once their 3-night stay that they had paid for was over. The group was also clear about the fact that they were responding to a long-term crisis of houselessness and precarity among African queer youth, but that COVID-19 and its economic shocks had crystallized the forms of inequality and created renewed crisis for the community. Part of the strategy was digital. Social media accounts, particularly on Twitter, were created to share and get the message out. The collective sought to publicize their actions and use digital media platforms to get their message across. Here, the importance of the digital sphere for creating the space to amplify more marginalized voices cannot be underestimated. South Africa, like many other countries, has a media that is, for the most part, wealthy capitalist, right? And white dominated and controlled. And so South African traditional media was often fairly dismissive of this protest in their group, especially since, much like the corporate media, it represents the class interest of wealthy property owners. Hence, while much of the mainstream media was sympathetic to the plight of queer houselessness, the idea that a systemic or structural change was necessary to address these forms of houselessness was out of the question. Instead, the sanctity of property was upheld as a value that should be respected at all costs. Social media, therefore, gave the group its own platform to be able to get their message out, which at its heart was embedded in a materialist critique of post-apartheid politics. Two of the leaders of the We See You collective had offered their own rented home as a safe house for queer and trans youth in the Cape Town area. Yet ultimately, they felt that they needed to offer a more engaged and spectacular critique of the continued negative conditions of African queer youth. And so with that spectacularization is kind of where we start talking about the sort of performative elements of this protest. Considering the spatial inequality of the city, the group members had this to say about their protests. And so they're talking about the neighborhood where the Airbnb is located. And they state, in this street alone, most of these places are standing empty. I mean, we did the research and we looked at the profiles of these places. And there are so many houses that for months and months on end had nobody living in them during a time when we are at crisis. And that is because it is so unfathomable to think about simply using existing infrastructure to accommodate and provide safe spaces for poor Black people, for women, for queers, for people who quote unquote don't belong here. Here, the youth highlight the fact, often discussed by homeless advocates, of empty properties, in fact, outnumbering the number of houseless people. What did it mean then for these homes in white wealthy enclaves in Cape Town to sit empty while poor Black and queer youth lived itinerantly? Ultimately, after receiving a great deal of media attention, and I mentioned most of it negative, the owners of the Airbnb went to court to evict the group. Rather than face a 50,000 Rand fine and the possibility of criminal charges, the group left the home about 3 weeks after occupying it. Importantly, the group linked their fight for safe spaces or safe homes to other landless people's movements in South Africa that they stood in solidarity with. Hence, they made the connection between the struggle of queer youth and the larger struggles of the poor and working class in South Africa to remake an inequitable system inherited from colonialism and apartheid. As artivists, it might also be useful to view their protests as a form of performance art, one that in the tradition of performance arts uses the public performance to stage interventive political conversations. So I'm interested here in thinking through how I might use the lens of Black performance to analyze this choice. Here, the We See You collective, we're also hoping to rescript the language of occupation, moving away from painting occupiers of land and housing advocates as dangerous and malicious, and instead moving toward seeing them as folks in need who have been in many ways failed by their government. So sorry, I'm just trying to, so I wanted you to read one aspect of their manifesto. So I just included that here. And they have a 10-point manifesto. So I just included the first point, which just says, and actually they kept using the word so-called manifesto because I think they were sort of saying that they kind of, these were sets of demands or sets of provocations, but not per se like an organized manifesto, right? So they just say, if you, your parents and family suffer from dispossession and disinheritance, if you require guidance, inspiration, or common ground, if you want to build trust, community, or participate in movement that honors our experiences, our terrible triumphant histories, and our incandescent dreams, then this is for you, right? And I think that notion of like the audacity of dreaming of something different, I think is really important here as well. And then I think the first point here is that we are alive. We're not defined by our work or our labor. We reject a social framework that treats us like are not worthy of survival, and that the survival is dependent on our ability to produce and be exploited. Our right is to exist in harmony with the living ecosystem. Our lives are far greater than what the governing systems of structural oppression would have us believe. These forced social agreements continually profit from our suffering, fear, and erasure. So I won't read the whole thing. I definitely encourage folks to go to their Facebook page if you can still find it. I think it's still up, to see the full text of what's happening here. But I highlight this because I wanted to just speak to I wanted to speak to the sort of utopian and I think somewhat socialist and leftist visions, right, of the group, and how there was a very explicit marrying of queerness and queer identity politics, particularly Black queer identity politics, to this socialist slash Marxist type of messaging, right? Let me see. Oh, sorry, I've forgotten that I had that quote there, but I've already read this quote. These are members of the collective in the house itself. So I will say that they got a couple of, friendlier journalistic pieces that were out in different narratives, but I would argue that those were definitely far less, but I don't want to make it seem as if there was no coverage that was empathetic or sympathetic with them. And these pictures are part of that. So ultimately, sorry, let me just make sure I know what my next slide is. Okay. Um, ultimately, let me just make sure I didn't skip something. All right. Yes. Ultimately, the City of Cape Town government did offer members of the collective an opportunity to engage in the bureaucratic process of applying for emergency housing, as well as offering WeCU members land on city-owned property in the Cape Flats, which once again are a set of sort of peripheral township areas in Cape Town, as well as potential support with acquiring building materials for construction. The group rejected the ethos of this offer. They stated that the support offered by the city of Cape Town was a space on vacant piece of land, city-owned land that was located in Philippi. They also offered support in the form of materials that may be used to erect a structure on this property. We know that the Cape Flats and the areas on the periphery are spaces that have been created by a violent and exclusionary system. They are not safe nor dignified for anyone. Here, the collective attacks the system of apartheid spatiality that has continued unabated since 1994, and the current government's choice to not significantly alter the apartheid geography. Furthermore, the group insists that these spaces are in fact not safe for anyone, the particularity of their positionality as queer folk notwithstanding. Thus, I'm interested in what these shifts in queer politics and this kind of protest might suggest. Increasingly, it appears that queer politics are taking on a more decolonial materialist framework. And this potentially could be exciting for thinking through how youth politics might shift certain kinds of material realities in South Africa. So I'm thinking here of the ways that this group is specifically linking their sense of precarity to the larger question of land redistribution and the unfinished process of decolonization in South Africa, particularly because land questions are often discussed in the notion of rural or farm access, right, in relation to mineral resources and in relation to urban informal housing structures. But I want to think here about the land question as a way in which queer precarity is produced, whether due to heteropatriarchal systems of land tenure in rural areas or to the kinds of material precarity in urban areas that disproportionately affect those who are queer. This, we might consider the group protests as well as their rejection of insufficient support from the state to be a form of critical resistance. Certainly, part of the ethos of the group was invested in moving away from state reliance and demonstrating creative community-based solutions. Sorry, I'm just trying to, okay. I just want to make sure, I just wanted to give you all another picture of some of the group members more closely. And I'm not sure where this quote comes from because I'm not seeing it in my talk, but hopefully I'll find it in a second. But we might consider so this protest was a very clever way to normalize occupying. It was also a way to think through the failures of the state and sort of not sort of entreating the state, but also kind of moving outside of state structures. And there was this interesting thing that they said, and this was the quote. They said that we're protesting a state that's seeking to buy time, that is captured, right? Generally captured by capitalist interest, of course, and that it's also keeping the wealthy comfortable where they are because nobody touches them. And so we dare to touch them in this way, like we dare to be disruptive, right, in a particular kind of way. So I want to take a moment to notice here that the collective speaks not only about how the state does not serve the interest of the dispossessed, but also how their queerness requires them to create certain kinds of alternative structures of maneuver, right? Or alternative structures of maneuver, alternative structures of politics. And so we could celebrate this, but we can also think about this as a sort of obvious critique of the failures of the post-apartheid, South African contract, right? Mm. So the group members also talked about the kinds of violences that they may have subjected themselves to as a result of putting on this particular protest. And they state that it's actually about choosing the type of violence that you would endure, right? So there was a choice to kind of endure this kind of violence because there's multiple forms of violences that folks are being subjected to. They said that we knew the risk, but we chose it. And hopefully, and this is where this quote is from, we will be given the opportunity to really show how we as a country of all types could work together to create change, to create the kind of economy where we're all safe, because the one right now does not work. And I think that this is a statement that kind of speaks to where these folks are coming from and the sort of political possibilities that they're trying to engender and imagine. Um, so I've tried by highlighting this particular performance and protest to offer just one example of how queerness continues to reimagine the political landscape of South Africa. I really appreciate comments and questions as I try to think through the analytical tools that I will use to flesh out these ideas. So I think I'm going to stop there. I will just say that I cut out a little bit of part where I talked about new Black political identities. So if there's time in the Q&A, we can chat a little bit about that. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate you listening.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Okay. Um, I know I have questions, but I'm going to hold off and uh, let's see, and then take sort of, if you have a question, either raise your virtual or your actual hand. And do you mind stopping your screen share, Xavier? Thank you.
Yes, I will do that.
All right. Um, I open the floor to questions.
I can ask a question. Can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you. First of all, I really appreciated this talk, and the quotes were very well chosen. The one that really got me thinking was from the so-called manifesto, where there's this juxtaposition between what it means to be alive and what it means to maybe exist in society, and the language of to produce and be exploited, and so that contrast between being alive and sort of functioning within the social and political structures seems to me a really salient point, and I'm wondering uh, to what degree we can and how perhaps communities can begin to disentangle this dependency on property, and sort of the way that the historical divisions of owners and tenants have been constructed, how societies can operate in a way to begin to dismantle some of those structures. And I recognize that this protest was perhaps a first step, but I'm wondering if the group has a vision for, how one might be able to move beyond the initial protest and actually engender some sort of of systemic change, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that the two things that I will say is that it has been really hard to kind of keep up with the group after this. And I think that so I'm very unclear, frankly, about where they've gone and what the kind of like larger intervention they wanted to have was, right? They've also been extremely reticent to do additional interviews or conversations or talks since, so I have not been able to kind of talk with them. I'm still hoping um, that I'll have an opportunity maybe to get out to Cape Town and kind of chat with them in person. Maybe they'd be more open to kind of that than the sort of like electronic thing. So my short answer to that is to say, as far as I can tell, that translation is not necessarily happened, you know, as far as the group itself is concerned. But I do think it's important to keep in mind that, you know, this group in many ways and the interventions that they're trying to make are piggybacking off of, I think, a larger reckoning amongst, you know, this younger generation of South Africans, and I'm really talking about fairly young people. I mean, pretty much exclusively under 30, right? Um, you know, maybe a few folks slightly over 30, right? But you know, younger South Africans who I think are seeing the contradictions sort of play out in in their bodies, in their experiences, um, and are not maybe as willing to engage the system or work within and through the system as perhaps the previous sort of Gen X, you know, initial people who had access to, you know, to the shifts in the 90s, right, of South Africa. The buying in, I think, to the idea of the post-apartheid state, I think, is fairly low amongst these younger folks, right? And so it reminds me when you talk about property of Ronaldo Walcott's work, right, and his book on property, and I think that there's a tension. And I don't think that, and this is where I think this tension could extend to a set of African and Black politics, both on the continent and outside the continent, as well as, frankly, to, you know, any kind of dispossessed class of folks, you know, but whether in the global North or global South, because I think that part of the tension that's happening right now um, has been that so much of the work of the 20th century politics, I think, were about inclusion, right? There was so much of this notion that that those who were dispossessed were simply excluded from systems, and we just needed to open the systems to those people, and that would resolve the problem, right? And I'm not suggesting that there wasn't a radical left that critiqued that, right? Like I'm really clear that, you know, that there were disagreements and so forth. But if we think about what independence movements were about, if we think about what even some of the early anti-colonial movements were about, when we think about the sort of corollary movements that happened in the global North around racial minorities and so forth, right? A lot of that was ultimately about saying that, you know, a lot of those were about saying there's room in this system and we just need to open it up for folks, right? And I think that what you're seeing now in the South African context is a bit of a questioning of that model, you know, as far as does it actually work, right? And I think a desire for something that is a little bit more radical or revolutionary. And I think that we're seeing that amongst African youth right now, right? I think that, and so I want to place this protest into that long array of the roads must fall, where I think a lot of this began to start, you know, in kind of 2015-ish, right? 2014, 2015, and the sort of various repercussions that have kind of come out of that, particularly, right? And I'll say this, particularly, I think the ways that a lot of these youth movements were very much Black led, right? And particularly the ways that I think that Black queer people felt excluded from those movements, right? And are sort of bringing a kind of queer, like they realize that they need to bring a kind of queer materialist critique to their politics. And so I think that I think that this particular protest is sort of swimming in that larger pool of criticisms and political movements. So I hope that that somewhat addressed the
Yes, thank you.
I have a minor follow-up to your response to Isaac's question, which is it's I'm asking you to speculate. You might not be comfortable doing that, but the reticence of the group's willingness, the reticence on the part of the group to discuss kind of where they are now or what they see going forward is interesting, given that it was clearly a public act, right, undertaken. Do you have any thoughts? And I understand the difference between putting something, in print forever, right, even if it's in an email, or perhaps especially if it's in an email, versus speaking face to face. But you're sort of, it sounds to me as though you're giving them the opportunity to frame, shape, articulate their own plans, interests, desires. And I wonder why they're not why they don't want to do that.
I think that my biggest guess could be that, as I said, there were a couple of sympathetic or empathetic, if we want to use that word, uh, portrayals of them in the media, right? There's really good work by Carl Collison, and I think there was another work kind of from a local Cape Town newspaper, but that was kind of it, right? Most of the rest of the coverage was pretty negative, and I think they were not treated, very well by kind of the press and community and so forth. And so I think that some of that reticence comes from like having been, I think, beaten up by that process in a certain kind of way, right? And I think feeling that, that's not the way for them to kind of engage and get their message out. That's just simply what I'm, and I think a distrust of the media, a distrust, I think, then of academics who are trying to engage with them, I think is part of what's going on. But I also, to be really honest with you, want to, just say that, for everyone in the collective, except for the two women who kind of generally were much of the spokespeople, these were all people basically homeless,
Yeah.
And so, it may literally just be like, we are trying to deal with our homelessness, right? That's still a very real thing, or we're still trying to deal with our lack of employment opportunities or whatever, right? So I want to keep that in mind. Like there's like real material precarity that folks are trying to navigate, and maybe an interview with me is just not very high up, in the wants and needs.
Yeah, that's interesting because when you spoke about the sort of choice of violences or the research that they undertook and knowing what they were getting into, I assumed, which might, which I perhaps should not have, that they would have expected negative, press, right? And and so, which you're not. I mean, obviously, you're not press, and academics are not press, um, but I guess maybe part of what the expectation was the legal action, but they thought they had more support in like the general media. Um, okay.
And I think there's also like, I do wonder to what extent, there's that tension between you can expect something to happen, but then experiencing it just kind of really sucks. And it sucks so much energy out of you in a certain kind of way too. Like I don't want to, as I said, when I think about the collective, I think about them as a group of people who, are living with a certain level of precarity that I think in some ways they had to overcome to even form themselves as a collective and do this action, right? And so I can imagine, right, that this group doesn't even really exist anymore, right? Like, I mean, there's, you know what I'm saying? Um, just because we know that there are well-funded NGOs that don't manage to make it past the 5-year mark, right? Or well-funded, you know, sort of groups of activists that like struggle to kind of continue in that. So I can only speculate, but those are some of my speculations.
Thank you. I see Aaron's hand is up. Aaron.
Yeah, so part of my question, I think you answered it towards the end of your submission in answering Professor Melissa's question about how the queer group solidarizes with the poor communities in South Africa. That also struck me when you were doing your presentation. I was like, what is the motivation for solidarizing with these groups of people? Is it that they want to take advantage of their vulnerability, or they see them as people that they can easily identify with because they themselves are poor and are from poor communities? You know, so I'm glad that you chipped that in. But what is of interest to me with that is we have known that these poor communities have not really come out of their poverty for centuries now, even after independence on the continent. We have had groups that have engaged in demonstrations and, you know, because of the land that have been taken out, the dispossession of their land and all that, things have not significantly changed. So my question is, to what extent would these queer group think that they are solidarizing with these poor communities of which they are a part of, can transform their situation, can make their voice heard? Because it is becoming more of a political, more of a social group. They even have a manifesto and all that. In Ghana recently, there's a bill before Parliament about, you know, legalizing, you know, these queer groups, and some group of people went in and burnt down their houses, drove them out, and it's a whole mess going on. And so they are calling for solidarity. They feel that they have a place, they have something to contribute. So my question is that, having witnessed centuries of dispossession, centuries of poverty, you know, on the continent, in their country, why would they want to solidarize with this same group of people, knowing that they don't have a future? That is the first question. The second question is, I think there's power relations here. Power is at play. I think these queer groups are usually educated people. They may have come from poor communities. Perhaps what they have noticed about these poor communities is that, you know, mostly they are not educated to a certain level. So maybe solidarizing with them would enable them to provide a platform where they can speak their minds. They will speak the minds of these poor community. They will articulate their ideals, their troubles, their difficulties, and their challenges. Now, do you see that happening? Have you looked at the educational levels of these queer groups? Are they people who will be seen promising to transform the situation that these groups they have solidarized with, you know, change their lives for the better? You know, so these are the questions that are coming through. Thank you.
Aaron and Xavier, I would just like to add an 8-second bullet point to that, which is I'm interested, as you know, secondarily, but I think it's very much related. Alliances across class. I'm interested in hearing about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think the first thing that I will say is that you know, for I think there is a way in which a lot of the sort of queer public organizing has been generally, you know, spokespeople and people who kind of are put in the public eye who are, you know, in a higher class position, right? But I don't think that's unique to queer movements, queer social movements. Like I would even say that with a lot of these landless people movements and other kinds of movements. And I want to keep in mind that a lot of those movements have died out in South Africa and are, I'm not sure how they're being remobilized, but the how can I say, the general body may in fact be not particularly well educated and not well resourced, but generally the people who kind of are put forth in the public eye, right? And I would say that would be the same case with this grouping, right? I would say that the major public spokespeople were clearly, had undergraduate degrees, right? But I would argue that most of the collective were not, from that kind of background. And I think that there's also, and I think this as well, but I think that in South Africa, it becomes even more, I think, egregious in the sort of disconnect between educational achievement and material benefits of that educational achievement, right? There's a lot, I mean, we can have a longer conversation about just a lot of the fact that, that most of these folks are unemployed despite their college degrees, right? And then it's one thing if you came from a fairly middle class or upper middle class background and you're having difficulty finding work. It's another thing, right, for a lot of these people to not come from those type of backgrounds, to have had their families make a ton of sacrifices for them to even get a degree, right? And then to not really be able to, secure the kind of material, I don't know if we want to say comfort, but the kind of material equality that those degrees supposedly are meant to promise, right, for people. So I think that that's a point that I would make. And then I think secondarily, I would just say that I do think that like I will say that a feature, right? It says that's what I'll say. A feature of much of left organizing and activism is optimism, right? It is this understanding that that we may not have achieved all of the things that we want, right? Or we may not even have been successful with 90% of the things, but that we've been able to do something to push back against this system, right? So, you know, there are a lot of horrible things that have happened, to Black people in the United States. But let's be clear: without a civil rights movement, I wouldn't be giving this talk right now, right? So, like, we can lament, that those movements were not, didn't do more to help the Black community in the United States. But we can also show that there are certain things that have changed, right? And I think that in the South African context, that's the case. I mean, there is no longer a formal apartheid now. I think that the leftist movement approaches that with both a level of cynicism, right, and being that wasn't enough, right? But I think also a level of optimism, being like, well, if we look back to the 80s, I don't think anyone would have thought that apartheid was going to end by 94, right? I don't think there's anybody that you would have talked to who was an expert on South African politics and society that in 1985 would have told you this thing is going to be over in 10 years. And certainly that it would be over without a bloody, almost revolutionary war, right? And so I think that, that's what I would say, frankly, is that the alliances are also about building certain kinds of solidarities, right? So I think it's about, I think, pushing back against this idea that the queer and the African context is always foreign, it's always separate, from that of the everyday folk, right? And that it's always, bourgeois, and upper class, right? And as I said, I think that there's a reason why the media focuses on those folks, right? And why the sort of public policy tends to, titrate towards those folks. But I think that, the reality of actual queer existence in any African country is far more complicated, right? As far as class positionality is concerned. And so I think that for many of these folks, there is an investment in this idea that um, that I think that like a true freedom and liberation, right, of South Africa, and I would argue the larger African continent, but let's stick with South Africa for this moment. That true liberation, true freedom, true decoloniality, right, does reimagine a set of gender and sexuality relations within the society, right? And we can think about a lot of the work that Sankara did in Burkina Faso, specifically around women, right? As an example of how, you know, there's a liberation ethos that says that, okay, but there's a set of gender relations that need to change if we're really going to have liberation, right? And so I think that queer folk know that, but they also know that the average heterosexual person living in their country doesn't understand that as an issue of decoloniality, and doesn't understand it as a material issue either, right? And so I think that explicitly taking a materialist stance and creating solidarities with other folks who are also explicitly taking certain kinds of materialist stance is a productive potential political pursuit, right? Now that doesn't mean that there aren't tensions. That doesn't mean that there aren't ways that either of the two groups might have their resources exploited in certain kinds of ways, right? But I also think that there's a lot of overlap, right? Which you pointed out in your question, but that there's a lot of overlap. And I think part of that is also about, once again, like the queer is the person living in the shack next door, as much as it's the wealthy person driving, you know, the BMW in the old colonial neighborhood, right? Like it's, you know, it's, and so I think that I think the ubiquitousness of that is part of what's happening there in that political maneuver. I hope I'm getting to all parts of your question. And then I'll just to add the tack on that Melissa offered, I would just simply say that yes, I think that there are, right? But I mean, it does require a certain level of you know, for lack of a better way, a kind of class suicide, or if, as Newton would say, sort of revolutionary suicide, right? That I do think that certain people are invested in participating in, right? And that's everything from, and that both has class and, of course, in the South African context, racial, you know, connotations, right? So I mean, it's also about you know, white South Africans willing to be certain kinds of race traders, right? And to not inhabit whiteness in particular kinds of ways, right? And so we've seen in various different political movements, I think, forms of political education that are about thinking through what the sort of cultural capital of an education, or even the material capital of moving up in class status, how oftentimes there are people who are perfectly satisfied with that, but that a lot of people are finding, hey, I did all these things right, and still, right, there's something happening structurally and systemically that's preventing me from frankly living in my own country as an equal citizen, right? And that something seems to be a larger systemic and structural problem beyond my own individual success, right? So I think that we're seeing some of that, right? That's happening. I mean, whether and how it mobilizes into something more concrete and longer, I don't know. But we've also seen on the African continent how spontaneous social movements have been able to create rapid change within fairly short periods of time, right? I mean, literally, like, it's like, wait, you know, there's people starting protests in January, June, there's a whole new government, right? Like, we've seen that happen, right? So I think that now, you know, we can talk about what happens after that new government gets in, and how oftentimes those new governments don't do anything drastically different than the previous ones. But, you know, I think that we've seen both the possibility of cross-class solidarity, as well as various different forms of identitarian solidarities across difference, right? And ultimately, right, you don't have apartheid ending without that, right? So I think there is a practice that that South Africans have of working across, right, and creating certain kinds across difference and creating certain kinds of solidarity. What I would say is different is, I think, first and foremost, a more explicit gendered critique of like what these social movements are supposed to mean in this day and time. And I think that an emboldening of queer communities in a way that they're not sort of leaving those questions for like, okay, this is what we'll deal with after, right? But no, this is what we kind of have to deal with now as part of the process of freedom, as part of the process of liberation, as part of the process of decoloniality. So I hope that addresses some of those concerns.
Okay, I'm going to do three things and let me tell you what they are and then I'll do them. Everybody, first, in a moment, I'm going to, since we're at time, I'm going to thank Professor Livermon. Then I'm going to stop recording. Then I'm going to stick around just for 3, 4, 5 minutes and invite Professor Livermon to do so if he has the time, in case anybody has any questions they didn't want recorded or asked more informally. Okay, so to the first. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your talk, your time, your generosity. And I think I speak on behalf, I think it's fair. Yes, there we go. We have some hands applauding. So I do think it's fair to say that I speak on behalf of all of us. I'm going to stop recording now.